I am Bill Carley, clerk of the Southeastern Yearly Meeting. Welcome to 52nd Annual Michener Lecture. Today our lecturer will be Nancy Fennell. Nancy has been a friend for 26 years and is a member of Fort Myers Friends Meeting. She has served her local meeting through her work with Ministry Council Committee and has twice served as meeting clerk. For Southeastern Yearly Meeting, she has served as a member of Worship and Ministry and as interim business meeting clerk. She is the author of The Path to Silence, Call to Deepen and Live Our Spirituality. Today she will lecture us on, her title of her lecture is Do Ye Not Know That Ye Are the Temple of God? Nancy will speak to us from silence. Friends, let us gather.
Greetings, friends. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm honored to bring the Michener Lecture to you today and certainly humbled by the task. I regret we can't be together, but I know and I'm thankful that we're all quite used now to coming together even on Zoom into community. A year ago, I began worshiping a half an hour each morning with a Zoom meeting hosted by Fennell. One morning, a quiet, deep bass voice broke the silence asking, "Do you not know that you are God's temple?" The question kept resounding in my mind, actually, because I didn't know that. And in a few days, I looked up the passage in my King James Version of the Bible. I found that in the full version of that passage, Paul is asking the Corinthians, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that God's Spirit dwelleth in you?" 1 Corinthians 3:16. As friends, we're quite familiar with the second part of this question, that God's Spirit dwells in us. Our expression of the same idea is, of course, there's that of God in you, in everyone. But I doubt that most of us think of ourselves as temples of God. So I gave some thought to what that might mean. What does the word temple suggest or symbolize? In the 2001 Michener Lecture, Daniel Seeger explained that the word temple originally referred to a particular place in the sky that seers studied to determine the right order of things on earth. Eventually, Seeger says, the term temple was used to refer to a place on earth which served the same purpose and reflected a sacred order sensed from above. Our dictionaries generally define temple as a place dedicated to the worship and service to a deity. Historically, temples and churches have been viewed also as places of refuge and safety. I recently read that the Dalai Lama defines temple much as I think Quakers would. He said, "I believe the purpose of all the major religious traditions is not to construct big temples on the outside, but to create temples of goodness and compassion inside in our hearts. Before our time together today, let's keep the metaphor and combine viewpoints to consider a temple an internal place in our hearts and minds where we worship and where goodness and compassion guide us in the service we offer each other and the world community. The only real instruction a missioner or lecturer is given is that he or she should share something of his or her spiritual path. Bruce Burchard, in his pamphlet, The Burning Oneness Binding Everything, writes, "We strengthen the spiritual unity of our religious society only by sharing our religious experiences and understandings at the deepest level. If we keep them to ourselves, afraid of how others will react, we shall diminish our religious society to the vanishing point." As background for the task of sharing some of my spiritual path, I want to stand on Burchard's statement to share one of my deepest level experiences. I grew up happily and safely in a wonderful middle of the road, mainstream Methodist church, pastored by the most kind and loving person I had ever met. At age 18, I married a young man from the Methodist Youth Fellowship. In less than a year, we moved out of range of our church, our families, and our friends. It's incredible to be now, but I did not plan to leave the church when I moved. I have absolutely no recollection of deciding not to look for another loving church community. Nonetheless, I didn't do that. And for the next 40 years, I didn't do that. I wandered in a religious and spiritual desert, attending church only on Christmas Eve, where I cried through the entire candlelight service. During that 40-year period, I had divorced and later married the second most kind and loving person I had ever met, Tom Dudley Fennell. One evening, my husband and I went to a fundraising spaghetti dinner offered by a small rural local church. While there, knowing no one, I watched people asking about each other, giving hugs and kisses, laughing, balancing babies on their hips, and I thought wistfully of the loving community I had experienced growing up. The door to spirit cracked open just a tiny, tiny bit that night. A week later, I was swinging a pickaxe, trying to loosen a palmetto plant that had an extremely firm grasp on the earth. I was growing too close to our driveway and scratching the car. The temperature was in the 90s. There was no breeze to be had. And suddenly I heard in my head very clearly, "Go look up the Quakers." I was stunned. I'm a clinical psychologist. I don't think that hearing voices in your head is a good idea. I was by myself on 60 acres of wild land we owned in south central part of Florida. My nearest neighbor was over a half mile away. The only explanation I could come up with was I must need salt or something because it's so hot. So I sat down, drank some fluid, ate a few raisins and cashews, and went back to my work. Later, I walked home and didn't even mention this strange happening to my husband. I had already forgotten about it. The next weekend, while engaged in the same task with the same stubborn palmetto plant, the voice again startled me, saying this time, "Go read about the Quakers." Now it was getting scary. What made it so scary was that I didn't know the first thing about Quakers. I didn't even know if they still existed. The next day, 2 consecutive hours opened up in my work schedule, so I headed for the library, local library, and looked up the Quakers. There were 2 books about Quakers in that little library. Friends for 300 Years by Howard Brinton and Barber and Frost's book, The Quakers. I could not have been more fortunate friends. I read all night, sitting up in a straight back chair so that I would not fall asleep. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Was it real? Could it be true? Were these ideas and testimonies and beliefs actually being lived? A new world opened to me that night, and very shortly, I put my foot on the Quaker spiritual path and have never looked back. I've been reading and learning about friends and spirituality in general ever since that first obedient trip to the library. Do you remember when you first learned about friends? When friends' beliefs first impacted you? God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. John 4:24. To return to our metaphor of a temple, we're told that the first important function of a temple is to be a place of worship. It's said that meeting for worship, a time to hold for the presence of spirit, is the bedrock of Quakerism, the glue that holds the meeting together. Worship itself is a simple act of love. That of God in us calls us into worship to seek love, to experience love, to surrender to love. Quakers have always distinguished between individual private worship and communal worship. Both are highly valued, considered sacred, and held in reverence. In individual worship, we're reaching for spirit, seeking to connect and to experience God's love, comfort, guidance, or forgiveness. We tend to focus on whatever is currently in our hearts or weighing heavily in our thoughts. It's a personal space. As Quakers, we're encouraged to engage in individual worship daily. We believe that first day worship alone is not enough to teach deep, faithful worship or to keep us centered in spirit from day to day. Our lives have changed drastically over the last 50 years, let alone the last 350 years plus of Quaker time. While we're working and caring for family, there may be little time to claim for ourselves, to sit in stillness, to enter deep silence, to listen for that voice without sound. However, we can and need to break in on God as God occasionally breaks in on us. We may speak silently from the heart anytime, anywhere. We can turn to God to express gratitude for a beautiful piece of music, or a smile from a child. We may speak silently anytime, anywhere. We may even turn to God for only 60 seconds to calm and center ourselves. It's not the amount of time that's the critical factor, of course, but the effort, the practice, the sincerity. When I was new to Quakerism, I was the only female psychologist in the county in which I live. I was in my office by 8 a.m. and left between 6 or 7 p.m. I tried to establish a routine time for my individual worship. After many failed attempts, I heard the saying, "Pray as you can and not as you can't." That was one of the most useful things anybody has ever said to me, and I'm happy to pass it on to you. I jumped at the advice, deciding I would just have to wait for the really deep daily worship time until I retire. I am retired, and it is a decided blessing when we are realistically able to have God as part of our daily routine, when we may faithfully turn to God at certain specific times during the day. Most often, individual worship is a quiet time in our hearts. There's time set aside for what that of God longs for, time to listen in silence, time to simply be in the presence of love. Friends recognize that our group worship is an experience that is distinctly different from our individual worship. In group worship, we are an integral part of a communal contemplative effort. This is a radical concept that we don't find in most Western religious traditions. We do not stand alone before Spirit in meaningful worship. Together, we seek the divine. Together, we listen in patience. Together, we wait in silence. We have one goal: to experience God's presence together. Thomas Kelly reminds us that in worship, we have our neighbors to right and left, before and behind, yet the eternal presence is over all and beneath all. Worship does not consist of achieving a mental state of concentrated isolation from one's fellows, but in the depth of common worship, it is as if we have found our separate lives. We're all one life within whom we live and move and have our being. End quote. J. Brent Bill, in his book Holy Silence, states, corporate Quaker worship is not a time of individual meditation. Communal silence is not a time to relax or gather one's thoughts. It's important that the waiting and listening in silence are done as a group. End quote. The significance of being together in a covenant community such as ours is addressed by Quaker author Tom Gates. He writes, in a covenant community, we are called together by God, because it is only in community that we learn what God longs to have us learn: the transforming lessons of love, service, humility, compassion, and forgiveness. That's a tall order, learning the transforming lessons. Gates is saying, to gather together in the presence of God's love, we learn that we are loved. We learn to love one another. We work together with love. We learn humility when we step aside respectfully from our opinions to yield to the opinion of others. In community, we learn compassion for each other and forgiveness of each other. Today, in the midst of hybrid and Zoom worship, we must be very vigilant, open-minded, and especially open-hearted when we gather for worship. We are still called together by God. We are still the same covenant community, engaged in community contemplative worship. We still need to be together in spirit and love. However, among Quaker authors who write about today's Friends worship, there are many voices raised in concern for this foundational tradition. As an example, our Southeastern Yearly Meeting friend, Michael Wida, writes, many of our contemporary Quaker meetings have a difficult time settling into deep worship. We haven't learned to cultivate a deep posture of inward and outward listening that waits upon and trusts the Lord to lead us in our worship. We trust Spirit to lead our worship. Many Quaker authors bemoan the fact that so few of our meetings for worship become gathered or covered meetings, that is, become meetings where the presence of God is palpable to all present. Instead, gathered meetings are considered now to be rare among unprogrammed meetings and are held in contrast to our ordinary or common meetings. There are reasons cited in Quaker literature to account for the problem of diminishing gathered meetings. They are the same reasons that account for the lack of depth in our regular meetings for worship. The requirements for deep, faithful, transforming meetings for worship are as they have always been. As we review those reasons, let us try to stay open to the guidance and ask ourselves, is this true of me? Is this true of my meeting? In a Pendle Hill pamphlet published in 2019, Steve Davison, author of the pamphlet, The Gathered Meeting, offers 4 factors that operate in our meetings today that contribute to less deep worship. First, he writes, it is thought that the decline of personal devotional experience hampers our ability to achieve stillness and depth in the communal setting. As I've mentioned, I understand how difficult it is to find time for personal devotional worship, but understanding that does not protect us from says my battery is low and it's plugged in. I don't know how that works. Anyway, understanding that we have difficult time doesn't protect us from suffering the consequences. Deep worship requires practice, your practice, my practice, daily. Are we doing that? Second, Davison finds the lack of personal preparation prior to meeting for worship puts us behind before we start meeting for worship. For many years, my husband and I had a long distance car ride of over an hour and a half to get to meeting. We turned the radio off, no music, no news. We just rode in silent observation of the beautiful countryside. We had lots of times to settle, to turn inward, to be silent in preparation. That long ride was a blessing for us. Are we following, friends, tradition of preparing for worship, even for Zoom worship? Third, with our theological diversity, we no longer have a single shared source, center, or foundation. We are not all together seeking the presence of God. Being respectful of diversity may cause some to feel discomfort or self-consciousness in speaking of their own truth. We friends treasure our diversity and take pride in it. However, it comes with a cost. Diversity often inhibits people from speaking their own truth, no matter what their persuasions and understandings are. As an example, those in worship who believe in God may have trouble speaking their truth to fellow worshipers who do not believe in God, and vice versa. Are we open to sharing our truth, no matter what is truth for others? Fourth, Davison says, we no longer consider vocal ministry a sacred calling in the way we once did. Someone in my meeting recently asked me, when we speak in meeting, aren't our words supposed to be the words of God? Her question startled me. I answered in the affirmative, but today, is our vocal ministry honestly thought of as the words of God or God inspired? Today, does the speaker think that he or she is speaking sacred, spirit-inspired words? I leave you with these queries. Thankfully, Davison also offer suggestions for improving and deepening our meetings for worship. First, he says we need a critical mass of seasoned friends, elders, who already know the way to deep worship and to spiritual depth. Elders are those who take the responsibility for the spiritual health of the meeting. They come early, they come prepared, they hold in prayer those who speak. Seasoned elders help guide newcomers simply by their presence. For the first couple of years that I was in Quaker meeting for worship, I sat in the circle next to Norma. Norma is a vivacious, energetic woman who exudes warmth and joy. We were close together, but in individual chairs, not touching. We both had our eyes closed from the start of worship. I waited. I could feel when Norma settled, when she went deep. I tried to follow in her footsteps. In effect, she led the way for me. Eventually, of course, I would wait for the entire meeting to settle, as I do now, as one by one, we all turned outside in to God. Davison's second suggestion for improvement is meetings also profit from a vital, robust religious education for all ages. It's particularly helpful when members and attenders can speak with each other and teach each other about worship, about what it helps us to center, about waiting worship, what that means. Religious education programs can offer and foster such opportunities to speak with each other about these things, to ask questions and to share opinions. Third, we need a meaningful approach to spiritual formation for new attenders and members who are interested. Most yearly meetings, including SEYM, have developed or adopted a spiritual formation program designed to support, educate, and deepen Quaker experiences, including that of worship. The small group format offers opportunities for sharing that which is meaningful in a confidential and hopefully tender setting. It is helpful if the local meeting and ministry and worship committees encourage such efforts. And frankly, I think it is harmful when they do not. Fourth, it is helpful if we make the commitment to prepare ourselves for contemplative worship prior to coming to meeting. Friends prepare through various means: private worship, reading spiritual material, singing hymns, sitting in silence, holding the meeting in silence as people gather. Friends prepared for worship come through the meeting door or turn in on Zoom, ready and centered, avoiding lengthy discussions or committee work until after worship. So to summarize, Davison's recommendations for deepening our meetings for worship are: we need to have a critical mass of seasoned friends, a robust religious education program, a meaningful spiritual formation program, and a commitment to prepare ourselves prior to coming to meeting for worship. Vocal ministry is a key part of communal worship. So it is that my heart sank when I read the first paragraph of the 2019 pamphlet entitled On Vocal Ministry by Barry Crossnell and Jay Brentville. That first paragraph reads thus: "You are sitting quietly in meeting for worship. Your heart and mind are growing still as you sink down into the spiritual depths. You hear a stirring. Someone rises and you shudder. Not in a spiritual quaking sort of way, but rather because you believe the speaker is going to spout a political diatribe, give a lecture, make an announcement, or just say something that won't be anything close to vocal ministry. You believe it's about to happen because that's generally what happens in your meeting. We might have smiled indulgently at ourselves when we read that paragraph, had it not been for the last sentence. You believe it's about to happen because that's generally what happens in your meeting. The concerns about worship and vocal ministry go way back in the history of Friends. In 1668, William Penn wrote while imprisoned in the Tower of London, "True worship can only come from a heart prepared by the Lord, and whatever prayer be made or doctrine be uttered, and not from the preparation of the Holy Spirit, it is not acceptable with God, nor can it be the true evangelical worship, which is in spirit and truth. That is, by the preparation and aid of the Holy Spirit." In February of last year, 2021, I wrote an open letter to my meeting. The crux of the letter is as follows. A few years ago, I was privileged to guide a workshop in Southeastern Yearly Meetings annual sessions. And the workshop was entitled The Unwritten Rules of Meeting for Worship. Attenders were divided into small groups of about 5 or 6 people and asked to make a list of the unwritten rules that served as guidelines for their home meeting pertaining to community worship. When the list was created, it was brought back to the larger group and shared with all present. As one would expect, there was tremendous overlap from one group to another. By the close of the workshop, however, we were left with a list of common shared guidelines, common to SEYM meetings, and in fact, to unprogrammed friends everywhere. Guidelines function to create a safe space where we can settle into a silence that is still enough to perceive the presence of God. Though not set in writing, these short, clear, to the point recommendations are distilled from years of experience with a contemplative form of worship practiced in unprogrammed Quaker meetings. They are as follows. Arrive on time in order not to disturb others. Maintain silence in the first 20 to 30 minutes of worship to allow time to center deeply. I said that one in red. Do not come prepared to speak. Do not come prepared not to speak. Speak only once in the hour. Do not challenge, change, or correct another's message. Keep and cherish the silence. Time changes things, of course. No doubt Zoom changes things, perhaps making it difficult to see or to feel worship as the sacred exercise it is. However, an unprogrammed worship does not mean an undisciplined worship. The practical wisdom in these simple guidelines is derived from the experiences of many friends, current and past, and we can afford to set them aside. If not modeled by longtime worshipers, newcomers may never learn the rules and the community suffers a loss. The purpose of ministry is and has always been to bring or to point others to spirit. That is the mission of all ministries, to point the way to God. Our vocal ministry is important. It is one form of continuing revelation. Ministry teaches us humility. It gives us guidance and imparts wisdom. Michael Wida commented, when the messages we hear are from God, they promote life. They lead to what is good. Vocal ministry needs to lift us up and give us hope, and sometimes to challenge and convict us as well. When we enter the communal temple with our communal contemplative worship and spirit-led ministry, we seek to connect to the living presence of God. We come to learn from the inward teacher. We come to share love. As I once heard our dear SEYM friend, Clara Diaz, say, we come to work on being good human beings among other good human beings. That's what we seek week after week. Early in my Quaker spiritual life, I remember that the hour of worship was sometimes too long. At those times, I wished and prayed that someone would stand up and say something that would help me find a focal point. Eventually, over time, I learned to still myself, of course. In 2004, I asked for a clearness committee in my meeting to help me determine if I should enter a 2-year program called Spiritual Nurture of the School of the Spirit Ministries in Philadelphia. Not only did the committee encourage me to do that, but at the next meeting, the clerk of meeting suggested that I pay airfare and books, and the meeting would pay my tuition, which was substantial. It was the largest single expense to date that the meeting had ever undertaken, and everyone agreed, to my amazement. I felt and will always feel indebted to my meeting for that. At the School of the Spirit, in the 8 residencies of 3 to 4 days duration over a 2-year period, I encountered the deepest worship I had ever experienced thus far. We were steeped in spiritual readings every day, in lectures, in discussions on those weekends. And we worshiped often, willingly, and eagerly. As a matter of fact, the teachers had a hard time getting us to end worship in time to resume previously scheduled events. The teachers would rise, and we students would just sit there. We did not want to leave the holy space. A truly deep worship is very difficult to end. When was the last time you were in a meaningful worship that was hard for everyone to leave or to end? Similarly, when some years later I served on the board of the School of the Spirit Ministries, I experienced the same prayerful depth in business meetings. Board members are business meetings. Board meetings are business meetings. So I know from experience that it is possible to consistently worship in the manner that Quaker authors describe as gathered meeting. I know it is possible for gathered meetings to be our regular meetings. There's a saying attributed to the Chinese that goes, "The forest is green when all the leaves are green." Friends, our meetings for worship will be gathered when all the worshipers are gathered. Initially, I was very hesitant to speak in meeting for worship. Actually, I still am. The voices of elders rang in my mind saying, "Don't get ahead of your light. Do not outrun your guide," or "Good ideas are not enough to stand on and speak," or Kathy Gaskell saying, "Don't speak unless you can improve on the silence." That one was an inhibitor for sure. Those warnings were powerful inhibitors for me. And in time, of course, I did speak, and I do try to contribute what I understand to be spirit-led ministry. Over the years, I too have had the experience of being in a meeting when the room was too hot. Those present were fighting or surrendering to sleep. The overhead fan had an annoying squeak. The clock moved too slowly, if at all. I'm there as a suffering individual, sitting on the surface of things, waiting for the hour to pass. That is, of course, a failed meeting for worship for me. But I look around, there are always at least a few friends who, under the same conditions, are holding up the group, communing with spirit, waiting, listening, silently and tenderly, inviting me to join in and do my part. There is no question that the second major function of a temple is to be of service, is a top priority for Friends. In the April 2021 edition of Friends Journal, Adam Isaac Siegel Isaacson wrote that what is really important to Quakers, even more than believing in God, is doing good in the world, practicing right action, or seeking to do the right thing. In the Gospel of John, the so-called Quaker Gospel, we read, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if they have love one to another." John 13, 34, 35. Service to others is an act of love. The lives, deeds, and words of our Quaker ancestors beckon us yet today. They ask for no less than our life. Let your life speak of justice, peace, love, kindness. Our charge, friends, is to practice love. Let's listen to some of the important voices of friends, past and present, who call us to sacred service. George Fox called us, we've all heard this passage, be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage in life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. Many friends call our attention to the close and binding tie between worship and service. John Woolman's life and writings provide an example, perfect example really, of service bound with faith. Woolman writes in his journal, "God, whose tender mercies are over all his works, hath placed a principle in the human mind, which incites us to exercise goodness toward all living things. And this being singly attended to, people become tender-hearted and sympathizing." And from Woolman's essay, Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, published in 1746, we read, "When we remember that all nations are of one blood, that in this world we are but sojourners, that we are subject to like afflictions and infirmities of body, the like disorders and frailties in mind, the like temptations, the same death and the same judgment, and that the all-wise being is judge and Lord over it all, it seems to raise an idea of general brotherhood and a disposition easy to be touched with the feeling of each other's afflictions." Woolman continues, "To consider mankind otherwise than brethren, to think favors are peculiar to one nation and exclude others, plainly supposes a darkness in the understanding. To humbly apply to God for wisdom, that we may thereby be enabled to see things as they are and ought to be, is very needful, and may be brought, that we need hereby the hidden things of darkness, may be brought to light and the judgment made clear." Michael Burkle notes that John Woolman's life is one in which service is an expression of worship, and worship a form of action. Over 3 centuries have passed since John Woolman wrote his essay on the keeping of Negroes. Yet, Harold Weaver, an African-American Quaker scholar, raises his voice regarding the same problem that is still before us every single day. In his recent Fennell Hill pamphlet entitled "Race, Systemic Violence, and Retrospective Justice," published in 2020, Weaver defines individual racism. "Racism is not merely an idea, a prejudgment, a prejudice, a prejudicial concept. Or even a mere act of discrimination, as so many of us mistakenly and freely use the term." Oh, somehow I got lost. There we go. Yeah. So, as so many of us mistakenly and freely use the term, that is not racism. No, racism is the power to act on one's negative feelings after people about people of different skin colors, ethnicities, races, caste. It is the power to have a negative, discriminatory impact on other people. So we were saying that racism is not a matter of concept. It is a matter of negative, hostile actions. He adds that when racism is embedded in an institution or system, it takes on its ugliest, most subtle, and invisible forms. Weaver urges friends to play a more committed effort, important role in seeking justice, and that we ought not expect the American Friends Service Committee or other Quaker-related bodies to do our work for us. It's noteworthy that recently some of our national Quaker organizations took as much as a year or more to focus on where in their organization racism was lurking and damaging their work. By increasing their knowledge and engaging in serious, worshipful discernment, problems were identified, addressed, and changed. Lloyd Lee Wilson asks us to consider both worship and service when he wrote that worship and witness are key aspects of Quaker life. One can envision the great circle of friends facing inward in worship, and then without moving from that place, facing outward in witness. Bill Tabor, a conservative friend and a trusted and respected prophetic voice of the 20th century, explains why our service needs to be based in spirit. He says, we are called to be alert and sensitive to the world's anguish, because there is one who is truth, the way, and the life, who can enable us to bear it. One who can guide us in our small role in healing the world. Marty Walton, a current, passionate voice, clearly and starkly puts our task before us. She writes, this is what we have to lay before God, our inevitable participation in all the modern day holocausts of body, mind, and spirit that humanity wreaks on itself and everything else on the planet. We have to bring into the light our complicity in a global system that keeps us in a position of overwhelming privilege and that will allow us to feel the burden of that responsibility. How we go about our service work is important. Also, Lloyd Lee Wilson, writing about a life of service, sets high standards for dealing with oppressive, difficult, or conflictual situations. He reminds us of how committed Quakers respond. The surrendered life is one that seeks to liberate all parties into the kingdom of God. It sees remedies that are concerned to lift up all parties in a situation, emphasizing the dignity of all involved, rather than condemning or denouncing one side as evil or sinful in various ways. Respecting all parties to a conflict or a situation of oppression will bring the condemnation of both sides. To be sure, it can be a lonely position to occupy. Wilson is asking us to serve and respect all parties in conflict and warned us that all parties will condemn us for not choosing sides. But in holding to this standard, we are following the dictum credited to Carl Jung, that condemnation does not liberate. The important voices we've heard from today, Tabor, Wilson, Walton, Weaver, call us to clearly name the underlying and ongoing damages around us, bear witness with those who are suffering from injustice and oppression, and to bring hope to the anguished. What role does our local meeting play in our service work? Well, we know that for our meeting's corporate community service, our peace and social concerns committees are charged to consider and recommend actions that deal with peace and social justice. Our committees bring their recommendations to meeting fruition with attention to business, to inform and to educate the entire meeting membership in the issues at hand. The meeting as a whole is responsible for supporting those actions which are approved by the unified body. Generosity is often called for when right action requires financial support. In my experience, I have found both the local and yearly meetings to be quite generous with all matters of support. Service is often a very personal choice that an individual makes, rising from a specific concern or leading. The role of meeting is to recognize, support, and be accountability partners to those individuals whose concerns or leadings move them to service work. In Marjorie Post Abbott's recent book, Walk Humbly, Serve Boldly, she asked our meetings to find better ways to support those carrying a concern and to find better ways to stand with those individuals. She recommends increasing the use of clearness committees, which are often used to clarify for an individual that he or she indeed is being asked to serve in a particular way. Abbott also recommends using spiritual care committees, as the discernment process involved in carrying a meeting is a spiritual process rather than purely rational. She also suggests that we use committees of accountability. Whatever the support is called, it is needed, and perhaps even more so if the meeting has not taken up the ministry as its own. Do you know the names of those in your meeting who are carrying a concern or following a leading? David Johnson, the Quaker author of Jesus Christ and Servant of God, praises the faithful witnesses in our meeting communities who raise their voices against wrongdoing. Those voices are the passionate voices in all of us. And he adds that certain individuals have passion very strongly, and their lives are committed often in a public way to activism. He notes that such people can make us uncomfortable, for it is their role to afflict the comfortable. What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? Micah 6:8. In considering my own meeting, I sometimes wonder if we express support and gratitude often enough to those who over many months, years, and even lifetimes faithfully do service in justice, mercy, and love. Often such people are self-starters and do not need specific support for their work. Yet I recommend the meeting consider documenting the meeting's sincere gratitude for their example and their service. Despite the nearly overwhelming social issues before us today and always, we need to remember that every single individual friends meeting makes its own effort to relieve suffering in their surrounding community and in the world in proportion to their resources. That is just what a meeting does, month in, month out, year in, year out. And as a recent small example, when something horrific comes along, such as the pandemic of COVID-19, when people in our communities were being laid off from work and experiencing hunger, our meetings rallied and reached deeply out to food banks and increased their normal giving in a heartbeat. In truth, we are living a life of service, whether we're sending a card or calling someone who needs comfort, writing letters, visiting politicians, helping a neighbor, giving a smile where it's needed, supporting a local food bank, or practicing a helping profession. Working in peace, love, patience, and kindness is in fact a radical spiritual path, and that path is walked by courageous people. It is said that the hallmark of maturity is compassion. Thus, when we see service offered out of compassion, we see the epitome of spiritual maturity. Meister Eckhart wrote, "What keeps us alive? What allows us to endure? I think it is the hope of loving or being loved. I heard a fable once about the sun going on a journey to find its source, and how the moon wept without her lover's warm gaze. We weep when light does not reach our hearts. We wither like fields if someone close does not rain their kindness upon us." In the beginning today, I asked us to consider our temple of God as an internal place in our hearts and minds where we worship and where goodness and compassion guide us in the service we offer each other and the world community. In closing, I also ask of each of us, let us keep our temples open, filled with light and love and raining kindness. Put simply, friends, let us love one another. Thank you.